What if I told you that one of the most powerful politicians in the Western world just walked away from power, not because of scandal or corruption charges, but because the truth about his failures could no longer be hidden? Justin Trudeau, the golden boy of progressive politics, the man who promised sunny ways for Canada, has just announced his resignation after nearly 10 years in power. But here's what the mainstream media isn't telling you about the real reasons behind his dramatic exit. This isn't just about falling poll numbers or political pressure. This is about a pattern of deception, cover-ups, and failures that finally caught up with one of the world's most recognizable leaders. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will completely change how you see Canadian politics and the man who claimed to represent hope and change. Before we dive into this explosive story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. We're about to uncover some serious revelations that you won't hear anywhere else, and I need your support to keep bringing you the truth. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about Trudeau's sudden resignation. Your engagement helps this channel grow and exposes more people to the real stories behind the headlines. Let's start with the most recent bombshell that triggered Trudeau's downfall. On January 6, 2025, Justin Trudeau shocked the world by announcing his resignation as Liberal Party leader and Prime Minister of Canada. But this wasn't a planned retirement or a graceful exit. This was a man backed into a corner, facing a political crisis that threatened to destroy not just his career, but his entire legacy. The official story: he cited internal battles and claimed that Parliament had been paralyzed for months. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The real story begins with what Trudeau has been hiding from Canadians about the country's economic disaster, while he was busy playing dress-up during international trips and virtue signaling on social media. Canada was experiencing its worst cost-of-living crisis in decades. Food bank usage hit an all-time high in 2024, with more working people than ever before having to rely on charity just to feed their families. Think about that for a moment. In one of the world's wealthiest nations, working people can't afford groceries. And where was Trudeau? Making grand speeches about lifting children out of poverty, while the reality on the ground told a completely different story. But the economic failures were just the beginning. What really sealed Trudeau's fate was the growing revolt within his own party. Behind closed doors, Liberal MPs were having heated discussions about his leadership. The man who once commanded respect and loyalty from his caucus had become a liability. The breaking point came when Chrystia Freeland, his deputy prime minister and closest political ally, publicly resigned from his cabinet in December 2024. This wasn't just any resignation. Freeland's departure was a direct challenge to Trudeau's leadership and a signal to the world that even his inner circle had lost faith in him. Here's what makes Freeland's resignation so devastating for Trudeau. She didn't just quietly step aside. Her resignation letter was a brutal assessment of his leadership failures, particularly regarding his response to Donald Trump's tariff threats. While Trudeau was focused on vote-buying schemes like temporary tax holidays and cash rebates to families, Canada was facing serious economic pressure from its largest trading partner. Freeland saw through the political gimmicks and called them out for what they were: desperate attempts to buy votes rather than address real problems. The pattern of deception goes much deeper than recent events. Let's talk about the SNC-Lavalin affair, one of the biggest political scandals in Canadian history. This wasn't just a simple case of political interference. This was about Trudeau and his office attempting to obstruct justice to protect a politically connected Quebec company. The ethics commissioner found that Trudeau had violated conflict of interest laws, but what the public doesn't fully understand is how this scandal revealed the true nature of his administration. It showed a government willing to bend the rules, pressure the justice system, and prioritize political connections over the rule of law. But even that wasn't the end of it. Remember the blackface photos that surfaced during the 2019 election campaign? While Trudeau managed to survive that controversy politically, it exposed something much more troubling about his character. Here was a man who had built his entire political brand on diversity, inclusion, and fighting racism, yet he had a history of behavior that directly contradicted those values. The fact that multiple photos existed suggested this wasn't just a one-time mistake in judgment. It was a pattern. And when confronted with this evidence, his response was evasive and calculated rather than genuinely remorseful. What's particularly disturbing is how Trudeau's government operated behind the scenes. Sources within the Liberals Party have described a culture of secrecy and control that went far beyond normal political messaging. Cabinet ministers were reportedly afraid to speak out against the Prime Minister's office, and dissenting voices were quickly silenced or pushed aside. This wasn't the transparent, accountable government that Trudeau had promised Canadians. This was an administration that prioritized image management over genuine governance. The economic numbers tell an even more damning story. Despite Trudeau's claims about creating jobs and growing the economy, Canada's productivity has been stagnant for years. Housing prices have skyrocketed to levels that make home ownership impossible for most young Canadians. Immigration levels have been pushed to unsustainable heights without proper planning for housing, healthcare, or infrastructure. These aren't just policy disagreements. These are fundamental failures of governance that have made life harder for millions of Canadians. And let's talk about what happened during the Freedom Convoy protests in Ottawa. Trudeau's response to those protests revealed something troubling about his approach to dissent and civil liberties. Rather than engaging with the concerns of Canadian citizens, he chose to invoke the Emergencies Act, giving his government unprecedented powers to freeze bank accounts and arrest protesters. Even a federal court later ruled that this use of emergency powers was unreasonable and violated charter rights. But by then, the damage was done, and Canadians had seen what their Prime Minister was willing to do when faced with opposition. The international embarrassments were piling up too. Trudeau's relationship with other world leaders had become increasingly strained. His handling of the relationship with India became a diplomatic disaster when he was accused of harboring extremists and interfering in Indian affairs. His government's response to China's detention of Canadian citizens was weak and ineffective. Even his much-vaunted relationship with the Biden administration was showing serious cracks, particularly over trade issues and border security. What makes all of this even more significant is the timing of Trudeau's resignation. He didn't step down during a period of stability or success. He quit just as Parliament was set to return and face a confidence vote that his government was almost certain to lose. This wasn't leadership. This was abandonment. Rather than face the music and allow Canadians to have their say through their elected representatives, Trudeau chose to prorogue Parliament until March, effectively shutting down democracy to save face. The cover-up extends to how his government handled information and transparency. Despite promises of open government, the Trudeau administration has been involved in numerous access to information controversies. Documents have been heavily redacted or withheld entirely. Parliamentary committees have been stonewalled when trying to investigate government actions. This pattern suggests an administration that had a lot to hide and was willing to go to great lengths to keep the truth from the Canadian people. One of the most revealing aspects of Trudeau's downfall is how quickly his support evaporated once the cracks began to show. For years, he had maintained high approval ratings based largely on his image and communication skills rather than substantive achievements. But when that carefully crafted image began to crumble, there was very little underneath to sustain his political career. The man who had promised to do politics differently turned out to be just another politician who prioritized power over principle. The impact on Canada's international reputation has been severe. A country that once punched above its weight on the world stage has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of style over substance in leadership. Trudeau's resignation has left Canada in a vulnerable position, facing pressure from the United States on trade, dealing with a housing crisis, managing unsustainable debt levels, and trying to rebuild relationships with key allies that were damaged during his tenure. What's most troubling is how long it took for the truth to come out. The Canadian media, which should have been holding Trudeau accountable from the beginning, often gave him favorable coverage and downplayed his scandals and failures. It wasn't until the political situation became untenable that the full extent of his administration's problems became clear to the public. This raises serious questions about media accountability and the role of journalism in a democracy. The Liberal Party now faces a reckoning. They have to choose a new leader while dealing with the toxic legacy that Trudeau has left behind. Poll numbers show them trailing badly behind the Conservative Party, and there's a real possibility that they could face a devastating electoral defeat whenever the next election is called. The party that once dominated Canadian politics for decades may be facing its worst crisis since the 1990s. For ordinary Canadians, the consequences of Trudeau's failures will be felt for years to come. The debt his government accumulated, the housing crisis they failed to address, The breakdown in federal-provincial relations and the damage to Canada's international standing won't be fixed overnight. A new government will inherit a mess that will take years to clean up, and Canadian taxpayers will be paying the price for Trudeau's mistakes for generations. The most damning indictment of Trudeau's leadership is that he walked away when things got tough. Real leaders face adversity head-on and take responsibility for their failures. Trudeau chose instead to resign and leave the mess for someone else to clean up. His resignation speech was full of self-congratulation and deflection, rather than genuine accountability for the problems his government created. So what was Trudeau really hiding from the Canadian people? It wasn't just individual scandals or policy failures, it was a fundamental dishonesty about his competence, his priorities, and his commitment to the principles he claimed to represent. He sold Canadians a vision of progressive leadership and delivered instead a decade of division, economic mismanagement, and political gamesmanship. The sunny ways he promised turned out to be nothing more than empty rhetoric designed to win elections rather than improve lives. The resignation of Justin Trudeau marks the end of an era in Canadian politics, but it also represents an opportunity for the country to move forward with leaders who prioritize substance over style, results over rhetoric, and honesty over political calculation. The Canadian people deserve better than what they got from Trudeau, and his resignation is the first step toward giving them the accountable, effective government they've been waiting for.